Joining us tonight, rested up from that event in the Big Apple, Christopher Hitchens, author and journalist, on the line from Washington, D.C. MP George Galloway's representatives had committed to his being in this seat, there it is, beside me tonight to debate Mr. Hitchens, but literally moments ago, they pulled out. Galloway's publicist claims the MP had a tough time clearing customs and was too unwell to appear. Too bad. Having said all that, we're very pleased that Mr. Hitchens is with us tonight to confront his Liberal critics who wonder why he is not with them on the issue of the war. Mr. Hitchens, good of you to join us, and we appreciate your staying with us tonight on Diplomatic Immunity.
Oh, well, that's easy for me. I mean, I already am in Washington. I must say I'm sorry for anyone who gets stuck in customs in Toronto or immigration. It shouldn't happen to any Scotsman, I don't think.
Your sympathies aside, before we get into this, it's obviously going to be a somewhat different program, but something emerged from your debate in New York City the other night that I wanted to ask you about. You seem very interested and concerned about getting Mr. Galloway to answer this question. Will you state that you never discussed oil for food allocations with Tariq Aziz, Saddam's deputy, and will you do so on your oath? Why did you ask him that?
Well, because I know the answer to the question, and because Mr. Galloway has received, I think, much too much praise for having refused to answer not that direct question. He claimed he had answered it before the Senate when, in reply to me, which he did not. It was one of the many false statements that he made. But
what do you think the answer is?
Well, just let me say one more thing. He's had, I think, far too much praise for his been represented too much in the press as a David versus the Goliath of the Senate, when in fact all he did was reply to questions and a mountain of evidence by insulting the members of the Senate, who I think were rather surprised at that behaviour by a member of the British House of Commons. What I think the answer is, I'll say plainly, as I've said in many places, Mr. Galloway was, and for a considerable time, a paid agent of Saddam Hussein.
Can you prove that?
Sure.
How can you prove it?
It's already been proven. There is no arguing with the evidence that's been amassed by the Senate committee. He was a profiteer from the Oil for Food program, and so was his business partner, Mr. Fawaz Zarakat.
He certainly denies
Galloway
that.
can sue me in any court in any country for saying this if he wishes to. But when the Daily Telegraph in London, for example, published a document making the same allegation, or rather proving, I would say, the same point, his lawyers didn't care to challenge it in court, and I don't think Mr. Galloway is in a position to be doing so. The fact of the matter is he was not just Saddam Hussein's cheerleader, but he was being rewarded out of the money wrung from Iraq, wrung from its people at a time when billions of dollars went to build palaces and an underclass of wretched, unemployed, frightened, coerced people was being created. The terrible moment, in other words, when we had sanctions plus Saddam, the worst moment actually of Western policy, 10 years of it. Mr. Galloway was one of those who was benefiting from this disgusting situation.
Well,
and I think his politics go exactly with his interest in this. He's now transferred himself to being, shall we say, a cheerleader again for President Assad of Syria. In as late as July, as recently, I mean, as July, he went to Damascus and told the Syrian people through their state-controlled TV that they were lucky to have such a great president as Mr. Bashar al-Assad, whose death squads, as you can see, have been fanning out against and through and across Lebanon again.
Well, you used the word cheerleader there, and I want to sort of flip the question around, because some would suggest that you have become too much a cheerleader for the war in Iraq. And so for the next 25 minutes or so, I'd like to put you through some paces as to why that is so. First, the moral defense of the war. You have told us Saddam Hussein was an evil, awful dictator. He needed to be removed. Fine. My question is, do the events of the past week, where we have seen 2 years into this war, 13 terrorist attacks over the course of 2 days, 200 dead, 500 wounded, the worst day since the war started, is the rationale still relevant?
Well, why would the attacks by jihadists and Baathists on the attempt to hold an election in Iraq be a point against me?
I guess
I'm not sure I understand the point of your question. Of course, there's a very vicious, well-organized attempt being made by agents of the former secret police and imported bin Ladenists.
But I guess the point
to destroy the prospect of a new Iraq, but that rather strengthens my view that we're doing the right thing in holding an election and trying to organize a compromised federal constitution.
I guess your critics would say these kinds of mass suicide bombings and wanton destruction of civilians would not be happening were it not for the American invasion. What do you say to that?
Well, the number of people being killed by the Ba'ath Party when it was in power was much greater. It doesn't have the power to do that anymore. And the number of people killed by bin Ladenists depends entirely on targets of opportunity. But Mr. Zarqawi, the leader of an organization which he is good enough to name Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, just to make it easy for us to understand who he is and where he comes from, what he's up to, a rival to bin Laden in my view, as well as a deputy of his. These people are in an alliance which it's masochistic to say only exists because we've been mean to them. I mean, they were forming this alliance long before a foreign soldier's boot was put on Iraqi soil.
I don't want to get into a numbers game with you here, but the Brookings Institution has said that there are between 10 and 30,000 dead since the American invasion. And again, your critics will want to ask you, how many people have to die in this war before it's no longer worthwhile doing?
Well, the Brookings Institution could possibly be right in those figures. At least it's an improvement on the absolutely politicized and fabricated junk science figures that are being circulated by Mr. Galloway, among others, allegedly quoted from the Lancet and from Johns Hopkins University. Those figures aren't believable at all. But when you say the number of deaths as a result of the invasion, what you're actually really saying, or I would prefer to say intervention, number of deaths since. Now, it seems to be all the difference in the world between what happened yesterday in Baghdad, where bombs were put deliberately to kill people and deliberately to frighten people who've already had 30 and more years of being frightened and bullied and killed, and the casualties that are inflicted in the attempt, as it were, to repress those people, to defeat them. So if we're to compare like with like, and if we're also to think, sorry if I go on about this a bit, but of what would have happened in Iraq if we'd let it run, if we'd let Saddam Hussein just carry on, and perhaps hand the succession to his sons, his charming Uday and Qusay boys, and continue to rule by divide and rule, and continue to build palaces while his people starved, and while disease and poverty and malnutrition swept the country. I don't think we'd be looking at a figure any less than about 100,000, and that would be still without a regime change, and probably would have led to the invasion of Iraq when it imploded by Iran, Saudi Arabia and Turkey all sponsoring their local clients, which would have meant, in other words, another Congo or another Somalia, another Rwanda, where we'd have still had to intervene, but on much worse terms and after many more people had died. So
well, let's take the question to the next level then, which is...
would be my mission statement.
All right, okay, let's take the question to the next level, which is, let me ask you if you believe it is incumbent on the world's most powerful nation, which, as Zbigniew Brzezinski has said on this program, was born out of, I think he called it, an ecstatic commitment to the idea of human freedom.
Yeah.
Is it incumbent on the U.S. to remove evil dictators everywhere in the world?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I used, for example, to know Robert Mugabe slightly, and I've seen what he did to my beloved Zimbabwe, and I've been following that struggle since it was southern Rhodesia in a British colony. And though I think that he has outraged every possible canon of decency and human rights, I don't think he's yet moved Zimbabwe to the point where the international community can say it's lost its sovereignty. You lose your sovereignty as a state if you've done one of any four things: invaded neighboring countries and occupied their, or stolen their territory. Remember, Saddam Hussein didn't invade Kuwait, he took over the whole country, said it's now all part of Iraq, annexed it. Tried the same with the provinces, the southern provinces of Iran. If you have committed a genocide or violated the Genocide Convention, which, if you sign it, means you are obliged to act to prevent or punish genocide. If you repeatedly violate the Non-Proliferation Treaty and mess around with concealment of weapons of mass destruction, and if you're the harbourer and armourer of international gangsters and terrorists. Now, those are the four conditions where the international community can say, that's it. Iraq violated under Saddam Hussein all four of those several times.
So you've got to have violated all four of those conditions?
No, any one, I think, if it's regularly pursued, will do. Genocide certainly will do, because, as I say, the Genocide Convention, to which the United States is certainly signatory, and I think Canada, means you have to. You're mandated to act. That's why people often don't want to say genocide, because it kicks in the mandate. The others, together or separately, make a pretty good case. But in the case of Iraq, every single precept and principle of the United Nations and international law had been violated repeatedly, and Iraq was in breach of more resolutions than almost any other country has ever been, and repeatedly so, and was under international sanctions, wasn't in that sense a sovereign state, and had its north and south portions patrolled by no-fly zone aircraft from originally Britain, France, and the United States, later Britain and France, to prevent the recurrence of genocide. This couldn't have gone on forever. Obviously, at one point or another, there would have been another confrontation. I think it was right to decide that we would pick the time, not Saddam Hussein, as he always had been allowed to before.
Okay, we've talked about the moral cause for war. Let's talk about the realist case for war. I'm going to start, at the risk of incurring your wrath, by quoting one of your least favorite people, and that's Henry Kissinger.
Yes.
Kissinger said, "I did not see how we could project the war against terror and leave intact a government that had the largest army in the region, potentially the largest oil income, and the greatest capacity to support terrorism. I thought, like Clinton, like Bush, like every other intelligence agent I met, that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction." Now, we know Kissinger's not your favorite, but do you agree with him on this?
It's not a matter of my agreeing with him, I don't think. I mean, Hans Blix thought that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Jacques Chirac thought Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. The peace movement, as it calls itself, thought so. In fact, one of the powerful arguments made, they thought, against intervening was you can't, because Saddam will kill too many people in reply with his weapons of mass destruction. That's in common. Actually, Henry Kissinger almost never lets me down, just as he was against intervening in Bosnia or Kosovo. He was for a long time opposed to intervening in Iraq because he thought it was too dangerous, and he has recently written a very stupid piece comparing it, as the most ignorant leftists do, to the quagmire in Vietnam. So I know what you want to do to me, and I must admit that even the mention of his name brings sort of a surge of bile up my esophagus. But what he said is something that any op-ed columnist could have said and did, and what was common knowledge.
Well, so far in the 8-year history of this show, no one's vomited on camera, so we're going to try and keep that record intact.
This is as close as you're going to get.
Okay, okay. However, Christopher Hitchens, no WMDs, no strong connection with Al-Qaeda, no connection with 9/11, and as George Galloway said, a war based on a lie. What about all that?
Fine. It's not true there are no WMDs for a start. You know that the UNSCOM, the most recent inspectors, still will not certify Iraq in their report as free of WMDs because they haven't found the ones that the Iraqis confessed that they had before the war. That's a plain fact. We looked at the inventory that they had declared, and that's after being found repeatedly cheating and repeatedly concealing and repeatedly lying. They were finally, after various defectors had blown the gaff on them, they were made to give out a list. Okay, this we admit, this is the minimum we admit to have. They never turned them over. They never had them tagged. They never had them submitted to the inspectors. They were always in breach of the resolution. Furthermore, we now know, as a result of evidence acquired after the intervention, but solid, absolutely solid, from Saddam's scientists, that a particular Dr. Mahdi Obeidi, who led troops to the ingredients of a nuclear centrifuge that he'd buried under the orders of Qusay Hussein, that program was still latently active, and we know that Saddam's people were in Damascus as late as March 2003 negotiating with Kim Jong-il's people to buy Korean missiles off the shelf. So anyone who says you can't mention WMD and Saddam in the same breath is fooling themselves.
Okay,
as to
but
terrorism,
did the Bush administration oversell the WMD angle?
in my opinion, as a matter of fact, yes, in a way it did, and so did Mr. Blair, of whom I'm more of an admirer than Mr. Bush. I think that they said in their minds and to themselves, and in some ways in their program, it's easier to scare people than to enlighten or educate them. And they said that Bush actually never did say imminent threat, but I think Mr. Blair more or less did, with his talk about how quickly Iraq could have mobilized. Look, I don't think Saddam Hussein, given his record, deserved the benefit of any doubt or the presumption of any innocence. He had used such weapons. He'd been caught many times concealing them, trying to buy them in Niger, for example, where actually the evidence that that was true is still upheld by British and French and other European intelligence services. The question was, could one leave that alone? Could a responsible prime minister or president of a democracy say, well, let's assume that Saddam is on the level this time? I wouldn't want to face my voters if I'd made that
Okay.
decision.
The other case that those who are realists make is, and there's a very famous book up here in Canada by a Canadian author named Linda McQuaig called It's the Crude Dude. Oil. In another lifetime, I think you probably would have been suspicious about oil. How come you're not this time?
Well, in a way, it's always true that policy towards Iraq is to do with oil. I mean, we might not be as interested in that region as we are if it didn't contain rather large amount of the world's proven oil reserves. And I certainly remember when Saddam Hussein blew up the Kuwaiti oil fields and set fire to them in 1991 when withdrawing, and also knocked off the wellheads and allowed them to flood into the Gulf. It was thought that it might take 10 years to repair that ecological catastrophe. If any of your viewers think that it's okay to have that amount of the world's oil, that narrow a base, that narrow a channel of trade controlled by a psychopathic crime family, if that makes them feel relaxed, good for them. Blood for oil for me was the time when under the Reagan administration, actually, and to some extent under the Clinton administration too, and Carter, it was decided that Saddam was a better friend for America than Iran was. We basically backed him, not just in his war with Iran, but after it, at the time he was committing genocide in Kurdistan. That seems to me to have been blood for oil, much more than this one was. But if the argument holds at all, it holds for all policies, including the ones that kept Saddam in power.
Okay, we have talked about the moral case for war. We have talked about the realists' case for war. In our remaining moments, I'd like to talk about the idealists' case for war.
I didn't mention the terrorism. I just didn't want anyone to think that I skipped it. Do you mind?
Okay.
You did ask me.
Forgive me, go ahead.
No, well, I should simply say Mr. Zarqawi was identified and found in Iraq. We don't know all of his movements, but we know he came from Afghanistan to Iraq, I think hoping to profit from the next failed state. So the al-Qaeda forces, or if you like, the bin Ladenist forces, were in Iraq already, and there's every evidence that they had indulgence from Saddam Hussein, as there is every evidence that the people who blew up the World Trade Center in 1993, in particular a certain Mr. Yassin, who mixed the chemicals for that attack, went straight, once he was stupidly released by the FBI, having been interviewed and given bail, went straight to Baghdad and was sheltered there until the intervention, and is still being looked for. It would be, again, a very, very naive person, I think, who thought that the evidence that Iraq was not dabbling in these waters was to be overlooked. To say, well, no, Saddam wouldn't do a thing like that. It doesn't matter if there's a rogue state that has the murder of Leon Klinghoffer as its guest, the bomb maker of 1993 as its guest, Mr. Abu Nidal, once the most wanted man in the world, as its guest. Of course, they'd never do anything really nasty. Look, would you, as an elected leader of a democracy, be willing to face your people and say, I thought that was a chance worth taking? I have to say I would not.
The idealist case for war. Do you
Yes.
really believe, not hope, but believe it's possible to create a liberal representative democracy in Iraq?
Hope or believe? Well, I know Iraqis and Kurds, this is the flag of Kurdistan on my lapel, who really want to do it, and who realize that it's the only way for Iraq, that there should be a federal and democratic process so that no one faction can dictate. There should be no solution via dictatorship or partition or racist murder or civil war. That leaves you with the chance of the only option of a federal democracy. I know there are real forces in Iraq, secular, leftist, Iraqi and Kurdish groups who are fighting for it. I will simply have to say I'm on their side. Do I think they'll win? I don't know, but I'm on their side whether they win or lose. What I can't stand is people who don't care whether they win or lose, or, as Mr. Galloway announces himself to be, take the opposite side and say that the real forces of liberation in Iraq are the jihadists and Baathists. That seems to me to be a straight-out capitulation to fascism.
And
I've taken my stand with these Iraqi comrades, and I'm not going to let them down, not even if Cindy says so.
Not even if Cindy Sheehan,
Not even
I
if
presume
Cindy
you mean.
says so. No.
I understand.
Sorry. That's how unsentimental I am. And you wanted me to be an idealist. Look what a disappointment I am.
The second part of that argument is that not only could Iraq be created as a more liberal, normal society, if you like, but that in the process of that happening, it could have influence on its neighbors and transform the entire Middle East. Do you really believe that's possible?
Well, I know that it's already begun to happen because I'm not, in this case, I'm not, as it were, relying on my own allegiances or my own Iraqi friends. I can quote to you Saeed ad-Din Ibrahim, the moral leader of the Egyptian opposition, spent many years in prison under Mr. Mubarak, who was the one who probably did more than anyone else to spark this very unsatisfactory process in Egypt, but one that has definitely begun. And he told me for the record, without the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, the logjam in the region would never have been broken. We've heard the same from the leader of the Lebanese Socialist Party, Mr. Jumblat, Walid Jumblat, and I've heard the same from Anwar Ibrahim, who was the main political prisoner oppositionist in Malaysia, a man who actually still thinks that the war in Iraq was illegal, because he's a lawyer, an international lawyer. He thinks it's illegal, but he's very glad it took place. It won't be long, I think, until we see very, very important developments in Syria as well as in Lebanon. Mr. Galloway's newest friend, Mr. Assad, and his ruling one-party system, I think, are not long for this world. And we know that the Kurdish struggle has spread very, very rapidly and dramatically. These are the largest stateless population in the Middle East, from Iraq to Iran to Turkey and Syria. And I wish them very well. I'm going to stay with them. Yes, we're going to see some great things, and though many of them may have been coming anyway, these movements of democratic change, there's no question what the catalyst was.